When drafting a constitution, lawmakers eventually hit a hard limit. They agree on basic liberties, but fiercely debate whether a Bill of Rights should guarantee socio-economic protections, things like food, housing, and healthcare. The debate hinges on a theoretical distinction. Negative rights, like freedom of speech, act as a shield. They require the state to step back and not interfere. Positive rights, like the right to health, demand an active pipeline. They require the state to spend money and allocate resources to fulfill them. This tension over resource allocation fractured international law early on. Shortly after the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the global consensus split into two separate treaties, one for civil and political rights, and a much weaker, less enforceable covenant for economic, social, and cultural rights. Traditional legal theorists argue this split is necessary. The orthodoxy claims that if you give courts the power to enforce positive rights, judges cross the line from interpreting the law to writing the national budget, violating the separation of powers. Yet modern constitutional reviews push back against this limitation. In Zambia, the Mungamba Constitutional Review Commission recommended making socio-economic rights fully enforceable by the courts, setting up a direct clash with traditional legal theory. Examining global jurisprudence shows that entrenching these rights does not collapse the separation of powers. Instead, giving courts this authority serves as a necessary mechanism to prevent systemic state failure. Democracies around the world handled basic human needs using vastly different constitutional frameworks. This chart shows three distinct mechanisms of enforcement. We can categorize them as directive principles of state policy, implied civil protection, and direct entrenchment. We evaluate these models based on one strict criterion. Can the framework successfully force the executive branch to actually prioritize the survival of its most vulnerable citizens? To answer that, we have to look past academic theory and trace how these mechanisms actually function in comparative global case law. The first model relies on directive principles of state policy. These are constitutional goals that outline social aspirations, but are expressly barred from direct judicial enforcement. Nigeria offers a clear example of strict textual adherence to this model. In cases like Okoji versus Attorney General of Lagos State and the Ondo State ruling, the courts faced claims based on these exact constitutional principles. The Nigerian judiciary ruled that these principles are declarations. Because they are not framed as enforceable rights, citizens are left without legal recourse when the state ignores them. India uses the same constitutional model but applies it differently. In the 1980s, the Indian Supreme Court initiated a ways of social action litigation to bypass the non-justiciable barrier. They developed epistolary jurisdiction, a procedural workaround where judges converted basic letters and newspaper articles written by marginalized groups directly into formal constitutional writs. In the Olga Tellis case, the court expanded Article 21 of the Indian Constitution, the civil right to life. They ruled that evicting pavement and slum dwellers deprived them of their livelihood, effectively absorbing a non-enforceable directive principle into a justiciable fundamental right. The court applied this interpretation in the Paschim Banga case, ruling that state hospitals refusing emergency medical care also violated the constitutional right to life. This approach forces the judiciary into a posture of extreme activism. Relying on judges to creatively reinterpret text often leads to unpredictable rulings and pushback from the executive branch. While the Indian court's willingness to intervene is notable, the directive principles model fails to provide a reliable framework for citizens to demand their rights. Model 2 involves jurisdictions that omit socio-economic rights entirely, relying on traditional civil and political protections to secure economic benefits. The European Court of Human Rights operates under this constraint. To address economic claims, it reads them into existing civil rights, as seen in Veldbrugge versus the Netherlands. In Veldbrugge, the court determined that the denial of state sickness benefits violated the right to a fair trial, analyzing the private law elements of the insurance to justify their intervention. Similarly, in Geigesus versus Austria, the court classified an emergency pension advance as a possession. This semantic shift allowed them to apply constitutional protections against the deprivation of property to secure welfare benefits. We see similar tactics in United States state courts. In New York's McCain versus Koch and Texas's Edgewood versus Kirby, plaintiffs attempted to secure emergency housing and equitable school funding by leveraging equal protection and state-level efficiency clauses. The structural flaw here is the requirement for immense judicial gymnastics. Economic interests are protected only incidentally, heavily dependent on the specific wording of a civil right and the creativity of a judge. Retrofitting civil rights provides inconsistent coverage. It cannot establish a reliable baseline for human dignity when confronting absolute poverty. Model 3 is direct entrenchment. This is the framework where socio-economic rights are fully and explicitly justiciable within a nation's Bill of Rights. This brings us back to the primary theoretical objection, polycentricity. Critics argue that enforcing these rights requires courts to choose between competing resource demands, a task they are administratively unequipped to handle. South Africa provides the proof of concept that addresses this objection. Their constitutional court has successfully navigated these exact constraints. In the landmark case Government of South Africa versus Groupboom, desperate squatters living in extreme poverty petitioned the court under Section 26 of the Constitution, claiming their right to housing. The court resolved the separation of powers conflict by developing the reasonableness test. This diagram shows how it works. The court doesn't draft a housing budget, but evaluates if the state's existing policy is reasonable. A policy fails if it ignores the most desperate citizens. The court applied this test again in the Treatment Action Campaign case. The South African government was restricting the use of nevirapine, a drug that prevents mother-to-child HIV transmission, to only a few pilot sites, despite the drug being offered for free. The court ruled the restriction unreasonable. Crucially, they did not usurp the health ministry's budgetary power. They struck down a rigid policy that prevented public doctors from administering available, life-saving medication. The reasonableness test allows a court to observe the separation of powers while retaining the authority to enforce the state's positive obligations to its people. When developing nations fail to utilize direct entrenchment, the institutional imbalance allows systemic poverty to persist. In Zambia, the state apparatus is skewed toward a powerful executive branch. Historically, this executive dominance dictated socio-economic policy. Successive governments implemented structural adjustment programs and poverty reduction strategy papers without a binding constitutional mandate to protect basic social goods. Driven by international financial institutions, these economic directives mandated rapid privatization, user fees for basic health, and deep subsidy cuts. They prioritized macroeconomic stabilization metrics over individual survival and social safety nets. The Zambian legislature possessed no capacity to check these policies. A legacy of one-party rule and consistent executive majorities ensured that parliamentary oversight remained weak. The judiciary was similarly constrained. Clashes like the Skinner saga, where President Kenneth Kawinda's party members physically attacked the High Court over an unfavorable ruling, instilled a deep conservatism within the courts, neutralizing their willingness to challenge the state. Without an independent constitutional backstop, the executive and legislative branches operate in an accountability vacuum. They face zero legal consequences for failing to provide basic human rights. This history validates the Mungomba Commission's core finding: financial constraints are no excuse for depriving citizens of socioeconomic rights. Direct entrenchment changes the court's functional mandate, creating a mechanism to evaluate state resource allocation against citizens' survival needs. The South African model confirms that courts possess the capacity to enforce these rights rigorously and reasonably, without usurping legislative authority. Justiciable socioeconomic rights provide the legal framework to hold a developing state to its survival obligations. By encoding these rights, a nation ensures its citizens have a permanent legal standard to demand the prioritization of human life over macroeconomic theory.